Welcome back to our next episode of Media Apocalypse, which is our series about the various threats that are facing journalism today, and how we can preserve a healthy and vibrant public sphere in the digital age. We're interested in exploring solutions, both legal and otherwise, for preserving the press function. Today's guest is an old friend, Martha Minow, who, among other things, is now the 300th anniversary university professor at Harvard University, but also was the dean of the law school between 2009 and 2017. And she has a new book that's coming out next year. It's called Saving the Press. I don't have the full title. What's the full title, Martha?
Subtitle is Why the Constitution Calls for Government Action to Protect Freedom of Speech. Good.
So she was kind enough to give us an early draft of the book. And so we have read it and studied it carefully. And now we're going to interview her about the book. So I'll begin. And the first thing I want to start asking you about, Martha, is if you were going to list maybe 3 or 4 of the top proposals that you have in the book for saving the press and promoting freedom of expression online, what would those be?
Well, thanks very much, and thanks for having me here. I'm a fan of all of you, and I do entirely share your sense that there is a crisis and needs to be addressed. I will confess, I don't think I've come across the perfect answer, and I don't think there is one. There will necessarily, because the causes of the problem are multiple, have to be multiple solutions. But that said, my top 3 would be a legal requirement that the republication or recirculation of news or media content developed elsewhere, but circulated through digital means, particularly the big internet platforms, need to be paid for. And whether there's some charge or whether it's somehow absorbed by the platforms, I don't have a view, but it needs to be paid for. And it is something that the EU has taken up as well. Second, that there needs to be a much more robust and secure investment in the public infrastructure for speech, which by which I mean not only public media, but I do mean that, but also the kind of support for for-profit media that requires use of tax credits, tax exemption, and even the kind of requirements that there be funds set aside that are matched by the tax code, by the tax policy, that are distributed to for-profit companies based on their actual revenues. So there are several proposals for that. And the third is that there be a series of efforts to address the internet platform's use of data, personal data, without payment and without disclosure and without even identifying the ways in which targeted ads happen. So a series of regulations that could be predicated on the basis of public utility or internet policy or fair trade and consumer protection, a variety of legal hooks. But I do think that that's necessary.
Well, so so let's put them in 3 boxes. One is a kind of a copyright solution, which is to allow the press to basically create a licensing scheme with with search engines and social media companies. And the question is whether or not Congress could nudge the parties toward that kind of solution. It has been tried in Europe with not entirely successfully. So there's an interesting question as to how you would do it. Would you use copyright as the hook, or would you use something else as the hook? The second is, we've talked about before in some of our other episodes, which is subsidization of the press. And that, have you thought at all about the question of how to find who qualifies for the subsidies?
Well, I have, and again, think that there are ways to index people's receipt of funds based on their usage. But I also, of course, would want to have some subsidy for those that are not already successful players in the marketplace. Obviously, there has to be insulation from any kind of content judgments, and we have seen the challenges that arise with the allocation of funds, for example, by the National Endowment for the Arts. But the insulation that has been developed for public broadcasting isn't bad. And there are schemes that do deploy people's tax, their own payments and their tax status as a way to allocate funds.
Well, I mean, one thing you could imagine is people could dedicate part of their taxes to a particular entity.
True, too.
Yeah, and so it'll have interesting kinds of effects. I mean, the problems that we've seen most are how you give incentives for the creation of new forms of journalism, because basically, if you tell people, you can devote part of your taxes to X, they'll pick Breitbart, or they'll pick a CNN, or they'll pick something else, whereas they won't necessarily pick the new startup that's coming on the scene.
And so, you can imagine an allocation that has percentage based on local, state, and national. And so the new startups, particularly that are really micro local, are not that expensive, but you can imagine a way to allocate so that it's the crisis in local news that I think is the most acute.
Right, and so one of the problems we faced is figuring out how the money is being doled out. How do you apply? What are the criteria? Are these things that you've spent any time working on?
Some.
Do you have any wisdom to offer us?
Well, I actually serve on the board of the MacArthur Foundation, which is a serious funder of a lot of these microjournalism efforts. And I think that there are interesting models that philanthropy has developed of creating intermediary organizations that give the grants and make them available at a micro level.
That's actually a very interesting point, because instead of the United States government basically deciding which startups they're going to help and which they're not going to help, you could create a bunch of trusted intermediaries and then basically set them the task of figuring out. And so that's a very good idea. The third idea that you talked about is the public utility model. Although public utility isn't the only way of thinking about it. It could be consumer protection, it could be privacy. Could you say a little bit about why the public utility model helps us at all with the privacy question, or with the abuse of personal data question? I have never thought that these things really meshed well. Have you given any thought to it?
Well, you've given an enormous amount of thought to it. I can only say that I think that there are multiple avenues of legal authority that are available in the United States to address a series of interlocking abuses. And in my mind, public utility is the best, but as you say, the consumer protection is possible. I do think that the threat of antitrust enforcement is also possible. And it's also imaginable maybe someday that we would even get national privacy laws. But it's less about privacy per se, which I do care about, but it's less about that than the way in which the large companies have deployed the pretense that they are free when they're not. And what they are producing is the product, and it is us. And in the course of our data, which are then sold and repackaged and used and collected by the large companies, there is a transformation of the media ecosystem from one in which it's open to everybody to one in which it's curated for people based on their past usage or their demographic characteristics. And it's that I want to unlodge.
Right. So that brings me to the second big topic I wanted to talk to you about, and that is the First Amendment. And the First Amendment plays two roles in the book. The first role the First Amendment plays in the book is kind of a set of guiding principles that could apply even to private companies. That is, it's a set of principles of freedom of expression. They're political values as opposed to the specific constitutional values. And they could apply with, Facebook would have principles of free expression, or when government passes telecommunications policies or creates public utilities, as you said, they could do so with the idea of promoting free speech values as opposed to anything that's required by the First Amendment. So that's one role the First Amendment plays in the book. But there's another role the First Amendment plays in the book, and the one I wanted to ask you about. It's the role of the First Amendment as basically the person who tells everybody they can't party. They say, whatever nice thing you want to come up with, whatever proposal that you have that's going to cure the problems of the public sphere, I'm sorry, you can't do it. You can't do it because the First Amendment prohibits you from that particular form of regulation, whether it's a tax on targeted advertising, or it's even the creation of public utilities for Facebook and Google itself, or for any kind of restriction on advertising, and the list goes on and on, or even network neutrality. All of these things are unconstitutional under the First Amendment. The First Amendment is basically taking the punch bowl away from the party. So that's a part of the book. That's what you discuss. Can you say a few words about that?
Well, thanks so much. I mean, to the extent that there is a new contribution, I think that this may be the biggest part. That is, I think that not only does the First Amendment not bar many of the initiatives that I and others, you, have come up with, but it may even point in the direction of requiring or requiring action in that direction. And my arguments are really twofold. One is, throughout US history, there's been major governmental involvement in the subsidy and in the building of the architecture of the media ecosystem from the beginning, from the postal subsidies to the orchestration of the licensing arrangements for broadcast, to the financing of the algorithms behind the internet. So the idea that the government cannot be involved now just belies our history. And it also ignores what I think were the very real purposes of the founders, to make sure that there is a vibrant source of news, not just entertainment, but of news, and accountability journalism, if I can use that phrase, the watchdog journalism. So I think that we have seen in the last 30 years the development of legal doctrine, particularly by the Supreme Court, that cast doubt on the role of the United States government, or any government in this country, using a very aggressive reading of the First Amendment as basically a deregulatory tool. And it's very striking to me that this has an old history. So my colleague Laura Weinrib has written about the reluctance that the progressive left had about the turn to the courts in the 20s and thereafter to defend free speech, precisely because they saw that the business community hoped to turn it into a new Lochner, a new basis for striking down any kind of regulation. Well, it didn't work that way for 30, 40, 50 years, but it has definitely worked that way for the last 20 or so. So that even required disclosures of campaign contributions are now in jeopardy. The precise solution that Justice Kennedy offered in saying that that campaign finance regulations were not required, and he said there can be forced disclosure, and yet his successors have now put that very tool in doubt. And one of the purposes of this book is to say, this is a runaway First Amendment doctrine. This is not one grounded in its purposes and its structures, in its original development. You are the true originalist, so I turn to you on this. But it is certainly at odds with the critical role that journalism and news have played in the democracy in the past and going forward.
Just one last thing about this. It seems there are three areas of First Amendment law in the book that seem to me to be things that you would want to change. The doctrines change slightly. The first are the doctrines of commercial speech, which really prevent almost every proposal I know of that's been floated for dealing with surveillance capitalism. The second are the doctrines having to do with disclosure, which you just mentioned, are really important for purposes of transparency. And the third are the doctrines, we might say the doctrines having to do with competition law and industrial organization. Those are the things where people fight about network neutrality, but also about trade secret law and its intersection with algorithms and their, right?
Yeah.
So could you say a few words about, you don't have to give a whole speech here, but a few words about how you want to reshape First Amendment doctrine so that it can actually be useful for the preservation of the digital public sphere?
Well, it's not so much reshaping as just rereading some of the foundational cases. You know, IAP. I mean, to understand that the actual ecosystem, the financial structure of the media is something that the government has regulated, can regulate, and should regulate, is something the Supreme Court has said no problem in the past. That one should be easy. It's just a return to the court's own interpretations of the First Amendment. With regard to commercial speech, there was a balancing test. It allowed for regulation, but it's recently become jacked up higher and higher and higher as a killer of any regulation. I would again not call for dramatic change. Just let's go back to the balancing tests that were there as recently as 10 years ago. And I guess I do think that one thing that is sorely lacking is a connection between the two kinds of First Amendment values with which you began. There's the technical doctrine, and then there's free speech values. Free speech values that are distinctively American and that go well beyond the state action doctrine. And they have been disconnected so that now free expression values live probably more vibrantly in private settings than they do in government settings or settings where the government's allowed to touch. And that's nuts. And so I would simply reconnect the First Amendment to the values that it has long served.
Thank you, Martha. RonNell?
Hi, Martha. Nice to see you, and thanks for being here. I have two questions. The first is sort of a theoretical one, where I'm hoping that you can help us kind of interrogate the boundaries of your position about what the First Amendment permits on the one hand and mandates on the other. And then I have a kind of more practical set of questions. On the first of these, I'm really interested in, I totally appreciate the dynamic that you were just discussing with Jack about the need to come out strong about sort of defending this set of proposals against likely challenge in the Roberts Court Lochner weaponization era, and to invoke the sort of underpinnings of First Amendment doctrine as reasons why those challenges shouldn't succeed. But I'm wondering about like the opposite side of this and the question about whether there's anything doctrinal that the First Amendment actually mandates here, whether there's an argument that can be made about that. And I thought it was really interesting. There are a couple of places in the drafts of your book that you sent to us where you suggest that there are a bunch of these solutions that might not be totally mandated by the First Amendment, but you use the word inflected. They're inflected by it, and maybe even particularly inflected by the free press component of it, the fact that the press is textually identified for its exceptionalism in the First Amendment. And I'm really interested in how this might map onto some recent scholarship suggesting that we sort of reinvigorate or identify legal protections housed within the press clause. And I'm just interested particularly in thinking about kind of what you mean by being inflected by the First Amendment, whether that's something more than a general invocation of the spirit of the doctrine, or whether it has some actual sort of legal doctrinal consequences.
Well, thank you for that question. And I, of course, am struggling with it and could use some help with it, but I'd like to say this. Ours is the longest ongoing in existence constitution in the world, other than the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. Okay, so it's old, it's creaky. It reflects its 18th century assumptions. It is written much more as a negative liberty constitution than the post-World War II constitutions of other democracies. That said, I think it's wrong to read it as solely a libertarian constitution. There are embedded in our Constitution a set of assumptions and a set of institutional arrangements that are presumed, and I do think reinforced by the Constitution. The family is one, religions are another, private enterprise is yet another, and the press is one that is specifically called out. The fact that the First Amendment has a special recognition of one and only one private enterprise, indeed the entire Constitution recognizes one and only one private enterprise, I think is not minor. So I do identify myself with a group of scholars who are trying to articulate and defend affirmative guarantees that are in the Constitution. Some are working on the Republican form of government as another example, or the petition clause as another example. And I think that there are many, many such elements inside this Constitution. It's one point in the book, I do invoke the suicide pact phrase of Justice Frankfurter. The Constitution was supposed to set up a form of government that could work. And that was certainly what Chief Justice Marshall understood and articulated. And that is the kind of first principles that I'm trying to bring us back to. If the interpretations of the Constitution and the First Amendment in particular reach a point that lead to the destruction of the press, which is presumed by the Constitution, then we have killed off the government that it was designed to create. I don't think that's what we should be doing. What does inflected mean? Well, I have struggled, some family members have said I shouldn't be shy and I should, in my subtitle, just say the Constitution requires a set of government actors. I use the softer calls for instead of requires. And as you note, I use the verb inflected, or maybe it's an adjective, I'm not sure. And I guess here it's a point that I and many others try to make as a teacher of the Constitution. The Constitution is not simply a creature of the courts. The Constitution informs and must inform the activity of all the branches, and I actually think of private settings like universities as well. And when I say inflected, I am speaking to legislators, city councils, to people who enact positive law. They have constitutional duties too. They swear to uphold the Constitution. And when I say inflected, I mean, if they really want to interpret the First Amendment, they need to do something now.
Thanks for that. I think that my colleagues are going to have other questions about the First Amendment components, but I want to get in a piece of a question about the practical dynamic here. And particularly, I really thought you hit the nail on the head when you described this as a wicked problem, right? Tapping into the management literature on that, right? So many, it's the thing that is driving all of us, right? That there are so many sources of the problem and also so many manifestations of the problem, and trying to figure out the interrelatedness of all of those in the solution space is really hard. And one of the things that I think we've discovered in a couple of our recent conversations that have made a light bulb go on for some of us is that a lot of the conversation that some of us have been having has been supply side. We're very, very concerned, as you are, about companies, social media platforms that are engaged basically just in repeatage and aren't responsible for the reportage. And so the reportage isn't happening, and there's all this repeatage. The people engaging in repeatage are getting the money in, the people engaging in the reportage don't have the resources with which to do so. But recently we've had a couple of guests who have highlighted for us that this supply-demand dynamic might also have a demand-side problem. That is, that the American public might not want news on matters of public concern or local news, right? That there might not be a market for local news, that maybe people only consumed local news in those glory days of consumption because it came packaged in this product that we've now disaggregated, the newspaper, but they were coming to it for the sports or for the funnies or for the movie listings or whatever else. They stumbled on news about public concern, but they didn't really want it. Do you think that I mean, I think there's data that suggests that that demand side problem exists. And how do we take that into account in the wickedness of the problem?
I do think it's a wicked problem. I do think that there is no killer solution. There's no magic bullet. But I also think that the demand side is more complicated than even some of the data indicate. That is, you need to put together some of the indication that people don't want to pay for news with the fact that between 2/3 and 3/4 of Americans think that public broadcasting should be funded and more at a higher level than it currently is. And that's across both parties. And when it comes to local news, you know that 50% of Americans live in communities that have COVID-19 cases and have little or no local news media. This is a public health crisis. They don't know necessarily what's going on in their communities, where to get tested. I think that we actually see during this pandemic period, there's enormous interest and demand in local news. There isn't a very good way to be able to express that. You saw the McClatchy papers were just sold at bankruptcy auction to another hedge fund. One after another of the local news owners are selling themselves to entities that unfortunately very often just hollow them out and create what we think of as ghost papers that don't do any local reporting. And I don't think that's what people want. And when you look at the Pew reports and other reports, that's not what people say they want. The kind of news that is most trusted is local news. And it's the one that's most in jeopardy and most disappearing. Moreover, you look at Black Lives Matter and racial justice movements. Ferguson, Missouri had no local newspaper, no news blog, no local television. And it required the killing of Michael Brown and the investigation by the Department of Justice to expose the abuses engaged in by the funding system of the local courts that layered fines and fees on poor people. People know about that now. And I think there's now a huge demand for that kind of investigative reporting at a local level.
Thanks. Sandy.
Well, I think the statistics would bear up, by the way, Martha, what you're saying in terms of the ratings and how people are utilizing local news in particular and their trust in it. So it's good to hear you say that. But I want to sort of dip back to and get a little more specific about an issue in your book that, as everybody who knows me knows, is very near and dear to my heart, and that's the press clause. I think we all agree that under current First Amendment jurisprudence, it's providing little or no protection beyond the speech clause the First Amendment is. And yet I understand you to be saying in the book and very clearly in question that RonNell asked you, that it was designed to provide what you call a specific guarantee of freedom of the press, separate and apart from the speech clause. In today's media environment, or what you imagine might be the environment in the not too distant future, what specific protections might you imagine it would provide? Or is it just an atmospheric?
You know, awfully important question. The press clause, you know better than most, has come to mean nothing more than the rest of the First Amendment, despite efforts by Justice White and others to try to articulate a distinctive meaning. I do think that the structural issues are one place where the press clause could be very meaningful. That is, if there's comes to be an interpretation of the rest of the First Amendment to jeopardize regulation of the ecosystem, of the financing of the antitrust approach or public utilities approach, I think the press clause could defend against it the same way that AP could be defended, that you could have an Associated Press that represented a coming together of entities. Granted, in that case, the court rejected the exclusion of some people from that, but there was a recognition that the structural economics of the media were an important part of the constitutional understanding. I think that that's where the press clause could play a role going forward. You know, I have had conversations with people like Anthony Lewis, dear departed Anthony Lewis, and others about whether the press clause should give a reporter's privilege. He didn't believe so, which surprised me. He persuaded me ultimately, and if anything, that kind of particular individualized meaning of the press clause is much harder now with bloggers and citizen journalists. Who is the press? Very hard when we get down to the nitty-gritty of individuals. But when it comes to the structure, I think there could be a real meaning of who is the press.
Interesting, because what I hear you also saying is that you are, the word dodge comes to mind, but that's not quite the way I mean it. The really challenging question that I can tell you dogs every conversation about the press clause, which is who's protected by it. And
I think it's a distraction from the current crisis. That is not the right question. I understand the question. It's an important question for other purposes. You know, I have worked on behalf of journalists who've gone to jail to protect their sources. There are causes that I care about, but that's not the existential crisis for the media.
Well, I'll be interested to see going forward whether anyone picks up your theme, including you, and takes it forward as a point of advocacy to help us build a constituency for the press clause. I was also interested, though, in how it meshed or didn't. I understand you to be talking about in terms of the public's right to receive information, sometimes sort of shorthanded as the public's right to know, and whether the press clause had anything to do with that and was really designed to pick up that theme more than specific protection for press entities and journalists.
Well, it's another way to get at the demand issue that RonNell asked, and also to understand the freedom of expression values as dynamic and not simply about those who produce, but those who receive information. I do think that all of that is crucial to understand both clauses, both parts of the clause together. I guess I think I wouldn't restrict, though, the right to know or the right to receive information simply to people who are identified as members of the press. And especially when we get down to these micro journalists at a block level of local neighborhood, often citizen journalists. Are they the press? Are they not the press? That's not as rich or valuable a conversation, I think, as some others. And also, you know, one of the great possibilities enabled by big data journalism, which ProPublica helps to illuminate, is the creation of data sets that can then be mined by people in local media, but also local citizens. And so I would hope the right to know and the right to receive information could be broad enough to include that. I mean, we have a crucial case coming up to the Supreme Court next year that doesn't look like a First Amendment case, but it really is, the Van Zandt case, about whether or not data scraping is going to remain a tool for the media or for researchers. And if it doesn't, then we've created seriously an arms race that that public interest will never be able to catch up with, because the private entities will control the data and nobody who wants to monitor them will be able to analyze it. So I think that increasingly the regulation of algorithms, as Jack said, the regulation of trade secrets, the regulation of data access is going to be at the heartland of freedom to know, right to receive information. And again, I wouldn't restrict it to the press in a technical sense.
Thank you.
I feel like I need to be called on.
I'll call on you, Scott.
Okay, thank you, Martha. First
Scott,
of all,
it is your turn.
thank you ever so much for being here. I have a couple of, I hope, friendly amendments, and I was wondering if you would be amenable to them, and if you're not, why? So one of the things I think several of us were pushing you on is the role that the First Amendment plays in the book, and I can see how obviously it plays a defensive role in light of the weaponization and the deregulatory role that is played by the Roberts Court over the last, 15, 20 years. But as a positive argument that this is what's required, I feel like that's, I find that less convincing, especially in light of the history. I mean, the fact that that Congress is empowered, let's say, to build post offices, and that they have built post offices over the last 200 years doesn't mean that we have to have a post office. So here's a thought, and I just was wondering what you thought of it. Let's say we didn't have the First Amendment. Let's say there was no First Amendment, or there's no press clause in the Constitution. I feel like everything that you say in the book would still go through. Why? Because clearly what the United States Constitution sets up is a democracy, and a republic, not a democracy, but basically a mechanism of self-governance. And it makes no sense to have a mechanism of self-governance if there are no institutions that collect information of public concern and disseminate it. So one can make an argument that's completely independent of the First Amendment, that a constitutional structure of self-government requires institutions like the press that play that vital, essential role in self-government. And that, I think, would be a very strong argument to say that's required.
So I'm happy to have friendly amendments. I do think there's a difference between the post office provision of Section 8 of Article 1, which is simply one of the many enumerated powers that Congress has. If it chooses to cash that check, it could choose not to cash the check. I would distinguish that from the press clause in the First Amendment. That's not one of the enumerated powers. It's one of the institutions that's presumed by the Constitution. And so that's just a minor friendly amendment to your amendment. But look, I've spent much of my career working on the right to education for the very reason that you say. I do think that there is an interconnection among the knowledge institutions and the preparation for citizenship that's presumed by a democratic republic and our Constitution. And that interconnection, my colleague Vicki Jackson is hard at work, as is Mark Tushnet, on developing the idea of knowledge institutions that are necessary for democracies. I'm happy to rest my argument on that ground as well. But I do think that the First Amendment is one of the elements here. And as Akhil Amar, your colleague, underscores, everything in the Constitution is interconnected with everything else. I do think that the First Amendment, while it was added after the original document, it has come to mean something more than we need a post office. It helped to explain why, from the beginning, there were reduced fees for the media and free circulation of newspapers one to another. That wasn't just a nice thing to do. It's because the people who framed the First Amendment understood how critical the circulation of news was to the activity of governance. But look, knowledge institutions preparing citizens to be able to read. I'm very proud to have participated in the Sixth Circuit decision recently that announces for the first time in the history of the United States that there is a federal right to education, vacated by the on-bank panel, but nonetheless, a decision by a panel and a settlement to that effect. We can't have a democracy, and certainly not a republic, unless we have citizens who are capable of reading and understanding their interests and expressing them.
Well, so just to say that I agree, everything you say makes total sense. It's just that one doesn't, I feel like you don't need to hang so much on the First Amendment when these things are so interconnected. And just that's just a strengthening the argument rather than. The second friendly amendment I want to offer is that one might think that the last 40, 50 years of tech policy might be a counterexample to the idea of government providing support to knowledge institutions, as you call them. But I feel like I wonder if, like, you could just flip that around, is that in this neoliberal age, that is the way in which the government has supported tech. That is, in a previous age, there was subsidization of the of media, mail for the post office. That's the way they did it. You know, in the 70s, 80s, 90s, aughts, the way we've done it is, in some sense, through deregulation and massive amounts of immunity. Section 230, the DMCA, safe harbor, things that you mentioned in the book. These are also, we should not like be in the Lochner mindset of not realizing that, in fact, these are the ways in which government has promoted knowledge institutions. They've just done it in this different way, and we've kind of run out of gas and in that way. And number two, the tech industry has gotten to the point where it doesn't need the kind of incentives that it was given in the past. And again, that's just another friendly amendment to the story you're telling.
Oh, I welcome that. And I couldn't agree more. I think the same, I'm not an economist, but the economists tend to view tax credits and tax deductions as subsidies because they actually are equivalent in terms of the financial benefits. And in the same way, I view immunities as a subsidy. And so these are all just tools. They're just tools the government has available to promote, to deter. You know, the same way with the early development of telegraph, the United States government used all the tools it had available. It bought machines, it used eminent domain to take property to allow for locations. It used all the tools that it had. Some we could call positive, some we could call negative. And Section 230 is a great example. It was originally designed to protect the possibility of innovation in a brand new terrain, the new world of the internet. And it, I'm sure, played an important role to the development. But now we have the largest part of the US economy is played by these tech companies. That is the driver of the US economy. They do not need immunity anymore. And so the same way that the United States has changed its policy with regard to regulating broadcast licenses in the light of changing environment, we can change the policy with regard to Section 230. I couldn't agree more.
Maybe just follow up with just one small, tiny little point about the way that the manuscript reads. The manuscript reads sometimes like, we used to have this history of government support of knowledge institutions, and that kind of ended in the last 50 years, and we need to revive it. Rather, I think the thing is, no, the last 50 years has continued this, it's just been in a different form, and that form has run, it's played its role, and we need to now rethink how to continue this, but in a different process, in a different way.
If it comes off that way, then clearly I need to fix it, and maybe it's a good thing it hasn't yet been published. I do talk, for example, about the U.S. subsidy of the internet and the National Science Foundation subsidy of the algorithm that's at the core of Google. And the U.S. Contributions have been both direct and indirect. And Section 230 is an example. So is the deductibility of the business expenses for the for-profit media. I mean, these are all tools that are available that create, you know, whether it's an uneven playing field or it's an impossible playing field. I am a thoroughgoing legal realist. There is no free market without the law. The law constructs what the market is, and these market tools have always been used by the government to influence the media.
Great. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I wanted to ask you one last question, and that is, at various points in the book, you meditate on the possibility of creating a 21st century version of the ideas that were used for public interest media. One was the Fairness Doctrine, was the most famous of them, which eventually goes out of business in the 80s under Reagan. But there were many others too, and they were all part of the basic scheme of a government support, that is giving access to spectrum in return for taking on various public interest obligations. Now, obviously, the situation we have with the internet is different. The technology is different. The way that things work is different. But you nevertheless suggested the possibility of some analog or something that is in the same spirit as the public interest obligations that applied to broadcasters. Could you say a little bit about that? What it would mean?
Yes. Well, Ethan Zuckerman has written, I think, the most interesting and comprehensive analysis of that. And so I commend that work. And I guess I could say it directly, but he cites Newton Minow, who happens to be my dad, as one of the architects of that early idea. When I got to college and wanted to write about the 1950s, and the history department said, that's not history, I said, it is to me. And the advisor said to me, you're the youngest member of the new frontier I've met. So I guess I drank the Kool-Aid, and yes, I think that the conception of a public service obligation was thoroughgoing in my upbringing and my understanding of, our obligations going forward. I think that there are so many possibilities to develop internet extensions of the public broadcast business. I'm very lucky to serve on the board of our public broadcaster here, WGBH, which is a major player in the world of public media. It is in 90% of the schools in Massachusetts and provides the digital architecture for teachers that has been so critical during this pandemic, but even generally. I think that there are so many possibilities, and with not that much money, public media has really done a tremendous amount, but it's been starved. And I also think that creating a trust fund to enable the development of support for voices that haven't made it into the existing ecosystem, very important. So many different devices that could provide the infrastructure. Some at the technical point, like the data scraping I was talking about before. Also the sharing of APIs so that there's more interoperability. I mean, I think there are many features if we were going to really take a thoroughgoing public service, public interest media perspective to the current ecosystem. There's so much possibility.
Great. Thank you very much, Martha. We really appreciate you coming on the show and talking about your new book, and I wish it all the success.
Thank you all. Wonderful questions. Thank you all.